Hello, and welcome to the Georgia Department of Education's training video. This video will focus on the Georgia Standard of Excellence SS USH16. Make sure you are looking at the wording of each element and relating that event or term to how it built a national identity. In element A, you're not only identifying the Red Scare. Instead, students need to understand the causes of the Red Scare and how this fear resulted in immigration restriction. Let's begin. A small group of radicals formed the Communist Labor Party in 1919 in the United States, and some Americans believed that this labor activism was a menace to American society and that it would threaten industry and lead to a revolution. It's really an economic and political issue that results in a cultural change across the United States. It may have lost some of its power if it had not been for President Wilson's Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer. Palmer was determined that no Bolshevik revolution would happen in the United States, and he used propaganda to make people fear that a communist takeover was not only possible, but probable. From 1919 to 1920, Palmer conducted a series of raids on individuals he believed were dangerous to American security. He deported 249 Russian immigrants without just cause. With Palmer's sponsorship, the Federal Bureau of Investigation was created under the leadership of J. Edgar Hoover. In January of 1920, federal agents broke into homes of suspected anarchists without search warrants. They jailed labor leaders and held 5,000 citizens without respecting their right to legal counsel. Palmer felt that the American civil liberties were less important than rooting out potential wrongdoers. Eventually, most of the detainees were released, but some were deported. The climate set by Palmer and Hoover spread, and sometimes members of the American public took matters into their own hands. The New York State Legislature expelled 5 socialist representatives from their ranks. States banned the public display of red flags. They really looked at labor unions, and they targeted labor leaders. And eventually, the Emergency Quota Act was passed, which limited immigration in the United States. In element B, students are not identifying what the 18th and 19th Amendment did. They're looking at the effects of the 18th and 19th Amendment and how they led to other social issues. The 18th Amendment banned the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol, and the immediate goal was to stop alcohol abuse. However, the 18th Amendment is going to cause an even bigger problem within the United States, and that is because of the formation of organized crime. The federal government grossly underestimated the amount of funds it would need to enforce such a law. In some areas, prohibition was enforced, but in areas where it was unpopular, it was widely ignored. Bootleggers smuggled alcohol in, and speakeasies opened to sell alcohol illegally. Because it wasn't regulated, alcohol sold on the black market and could be very unsafe. In large cities, organized crime led by crime bosses sprang up. The negative effects of the 18th Amendment far outweigh the positive. People protested the amendment, claiming it violated civil liberties, and in the end, it was repealed by the 21st Amendment. The 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote, also affects the shared identity. The suffrage movement created higher expectations for women. By the early 20th century, women were able to attend college and to train for professions, although not in the same number as men. They began to enter male-dominated professions. Women's economic roles increased in society, salaries increased, and women increasingly joined the workforce, making new careers, and family life begins to change. Politicians also began to cater to these new voters. Political campaigns began advertising to the woman's voice. Advertising and the development of the automobile may have had the largest effect on developing a shared identity across the United States. The automobile was made possible by mass production, which made goods more affordable. Companies were able to produce goods quicker and cheaper, and Henry Ford was the first to be successful in the introduction of the assembly line. He reduced options for the automobile and paid his workers more than other firms to increase his productivity. The automobile greatly transformed the U.S. People could now travel in a more affordable and faster manner, which meant many families were able to afford vacations. Roads were constructed, creating new jobs. Gas stations, motels, and diners popped up across the American landscape. People stopped using railroads for travel, and states began forming driving regulations such as licenses. Advertising capitalized on people's hopes and fears in order to sell more and more goods. Fueling consumer demand were new techniques in advertising. Advertising was not a new business, but in the increasingly competitive marketplace, manufacturers looked for more and more aggressive advertising campaigns. One major trend of the decade was to use pop psychology methods to convince Americans that the product was needed. Advertisers were no longer simply responding to demand, they were creating the demand. Radio became an important means of communicating a business's message. Testimonials from Hollywood film stars sold products in record numbers. The advertising business created demand for gadgets and appliances being manufactured by American factories, and if you couldn't afford it, there was always buying on installment. Radio had a large effect on unifying the national culture. One of the great attractions to the radio listener was that once the cost of the original equipment was covered, radio was free. That's because stations made their money by selling airtime to advertisers. The possibility of reaching millions of people at once had advertising executives scrambling to take advantage. By the end of the decade, advertisers paid over $10,000 for an hour of premium time. Again, this links back to advertising also creating a national culture. People bought items they were told they couldn't live without, and suddenly keeping up with the Joneses became more and more important, especially if a radio celebrity endorsed a product. The movie industry also catered to mass audiences. Every town seemed to have at least one theater and millions flocked to the screens to see silent action films and slapstick comedies. The first talking picture, The Jazz Singer, appeared in 1927. Walt Disney introduced Mickey Mouse to the American public the following year in Steamboat Willie, and by the end of the decade, over 100 million viewers attended movie houses each week, more than the number of weekly churchgoers. With the availability of radio and movies, new forms of cultural expression began to spread. The Great Migration relocated hundreds of thousands of African Americans or blacks from the rural South to the urban North. Many discovered they had shared common experiences in their past histories and their uncertain present circumstances, and this ignited an explosion of cultural pride. Indeed, African American or black culture was reborn in what will be known as the Harlem Renaissance. Most new immigrants found themselves segregated by practice in rundown urban slums. The largest of these was Harlem. Writers, actors, artists, and musicians glorified African American traditions and at the same time created new ones. No aspect of the Harlem Renaissance shaped America and the entire world as much as jazz. Following World War I, there was a mass migration of jazz musicians from New Orleans to major northern cities like Chicago and New York, leading to a wider dispersal of jazz as different styles developed in different cities. Because of its popularity in speakeasies and the emergence of more advanced recording devices, jazz became very popular in a very short amount of time. With the introduction of large-scale radio broadcasts in 1922, Americans were able to experience different styles of music without physically visiting a jazz club.
This is a great standard for including primary, secondary, and media sources of the time period. So I'm going to start by taking you to a website called America in Class. America in Class includes themed lessons and sources for different elements in this standard. A great one to use with the Red Scare is a collection of political cartoons and the lesson plan that goes with it. They have an analysis sheet that students can use, and you can really see how the cartoons turn the political atmosphere in the United States. Another of these themed units from this website is Wets and Dries, and this deals with the issue of prohibition. Again, you have political cartoons and an analysis sheet. You have a lesson plan should prohibition be repealed. But one of the neat things are the newsreels that are included in this lesson. Another good website for the Red Scare that holds a lot of political cartoons comes from the Opera Project, and it uses editorial cartoons to teach history. Again, it's a website that you can find lots of political cartoons, not only about the Red Scare, but any of the topics that are mentioned in this element or in this standard. A good site to look at consumerism and consumption is UnveilingHistory.Org. At this site, you can find a good lesson plan that includes primary sources and activities for the class so that they can see how consumerism caught on. But a really great strategy and hook for a lesson on consumerism is to actually show advertisements of the 1920s and how they are so much different from our advertisements today. Kids really enjoy looking at them, looking at the slogans that were developed during that time. A great way to teach the emergence of jazz is to actually have students listen to the jazz musicians of that time period. JazzInAmerica.org includes a lot of jazz resources with links to the musicians and actual clips of their songs and their performances.